Some actions and or interventions are leveraged and can create openings or change conditions that make dozens of other changes and or actions possible or more easeful, or in the case of difficult things, more difficult tasks, unnecessary.
You're listening to the Joyous Justice Podcast with award-winning social justice leader and coach, Kohenet April Nichole Baskin. Let's journey into the realms of love and liberation together, dissolving internal barriers and deconstructing systemic oppression from the inside out. Whether you're leading change in an organization or your own life, your next step to advancing joyous justice starts here.
OCO. In this two-part episode, I'm going to follow up on an idea that I mentioned offhand in the last episode and begin to talk about that, unpack it, reframe it a bit, and then get more in depth in part 2 of this episode. So there will be 2 parts to this episode this week, and I hope you enjoy and that you find and absolutely feel that the second half was absolutely worth the wait. I believe it will be, because that's where a lot of the magic is. So part 1 is around setting the scene and offering an initial reframe, and the second part will involve a little bit of storytelling, and the second part will continue into next steps and practicalities and new possibilities and ideas. I'm so excited you're along for this ride. Let's go. So in the soft relaunch episode recently, I shared multiple different ideas. And as I was listening back to the recording, I realized, there's a whole other episode I could do to further explain this. Or I'm hearing how I'm saying this, which made sense in the context of that conversation. But I don't want my listeners to get the wrong idea about some other important and related things. So in the last episode, I said, I know, as I'm talking about all this, you might be thinking, we've got a lot of fucking work to do. And that is absolutely true. There is revamping and deconstructing and breaking down and burning, repairing, rebuilding, reimagining, transforming. There is a lot of work that we have ahead of us, and we do personally, collectively, societally, and globally. But a lot of work is not the same as endless work. And one of the things I've become increasingly interested in is how many people feel overwhelmed by the very idea of transformation. And obviously, understandably so. But let's look at the causes of why. In my estimation, they think there's too much to fix, too much work, not enough time. And generally speaking, I and we can never get all of this done. And I think part of the problem here is that many of us inherited deeply incomplete models of transformation and how transformation can operate and the options around transformation, just a deeper understanding of transformation itself. So let's get into it. One of the things that gets in the way of transformation is that many of us inherited distorted models of how transformation actually happens, as I was just saying a moment ago. Most people have been taught transformation through extremely linear, production-oriented frameworks, step by step, grind harder, work more, fix more things, optimize, produce. Yikes. I want to shake after all that. I mean, it's the milieu, the ideologies we swim and operate within. But oh my goodness. Okay, back on track. And to be clear, I'm not saying effort doesn't matter. Effort is always a variable, and obviously it matters. Discipline matters, and consistency can be very important. Consistency, to be honest, is a complex concept for certainly me and other folks who are either neurospicy like me or are navigating other forms of mental or physical disabilities, because sometimes it's just not an option. And by the very nature of capitalism, consistency is lauded as this wonderful foundational element of success. And I can tell you, as someone who's been quite successful in my life, that it is not absolutely required. It can be very helpful. And I continue to strive for it in certain ways. And so it's important, but I just want to name that consistency does matter. But because of these supremacy dynamics, it's so heavily overweighted. Right. And so many of us have been taught a version of transformation that is deeply shaped by neurotypical linearity, capitalism's production logic and needs, urgency culture, and fear-based ways of relating to change. And again, the pressures and the messages we've gotten that are swirling in our own mind from our own conditioning, as well as ongoing conditioning and messaging we receive subtly and explicitly through a variety of sources, sound something like everything is important all the time, everything is urgent, lots of these different things need attention and tending right now. And often, if you or I are not making progress, the assumption frequently is just work harder. So for many people, that creates a constant sense of overwhelm. I know it often has for me, because if everything matters, which we know it doesn't, but also y'all get what I'm saying here. If everything is urgent, how does one prioritize? And if every situation requires maximum or seems to demand maximum effort, how do you sustain yourself? What I've come to believe is that transformation is often much more strategic and leveraged than people realize. Not always necessarily easy, though it definitely can be at times, or easier than people perceive or misperceive it to be. And also not necessarily effortless, but still far more strategic. So let's get into one of these assumptions that I just mentioned that I believe is a misunderstanding, is that many people have been conditioned consciously and just unconsciously to feel and sense that all actions are equally consequential. And as likely many of us know, just upon hearing this directly, explicitly, they are not all equal. Some actions and or interventions are leveraged and can create openings or change conditions that make dozens of other changes and or actions possible or more easeful, or in the case of difficult things, more difficult tasks, unnecessary. And on top of all of that, many actions, while well-intentioned, don't actually move much at all. They seem important in the moment, but they aren't actually helping us to move the dial on any number of our intentions, objectives, or goals. I often think about this through the lens of leverage. Shout out to Gary Keller and Jay Papasan, who wrote the book, The One Thing. If you'd like to learn more about this subject, definitely check out that book or watch some YouTube videos about it. Either way, it's very much worth your time. There are all kinds of different levers and ladders. You might have stairs to climb, but you could take a course of action that would help you. For instance, you could decide to take on a task of exploring around the mall and notice, in this other location with a little bit more effort, you could find an escalator. So you take one step and then the rest of the steps are handled. And by choosing to take a little bit of time to find an escalator instead of the staircase, rather than having to take 80 steps, you just took a few more to find it. And then everything else in terms of getting to that next floor was made easier or unnecessary. So steps were made unnecessary and the whole process was made easier. There's likely many, many, many other examples we could think about this in terms of leverage. Another simple but hopefully helpful metaphor could be sometimes they're pushing against a wall, and sometimes there's just a doorway that's a few feet away that we could walk through. Or if we're trying to bring the wall down or the barrier down based upon capitalist conditioning, we might think we might have to remove every brick across the whole wall, or maybe even in a section of the wall. But we could notice, like hypothetically, if you start at the base of the wall and you took a little bit more prep time, you could set up some safety measures so that you could strategically remove the bottom base and therefore successfully topple the whole wall more rapidly in a matter of hours rather than days of buying ladders and getting all kinds of supplies and doing different things. And this seems kind of simple with these examples, but there's all kinds of examples in other parts of our life that I'll get to in a moment, where it's maybe not immediately obvious to a number of people, but there is leveraged prioritization and action that can be taken that takes us out of linear mode and into leveraged, accelerated progress with minimal additional effort. This is one of the reasons why I love the question from Papasan and Keller's book, The One Thing. Their central question in the book is, oh, hear the fairies sing. What's one thing we can do, focus on, or eliminate such that by doing it or eliminating it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary in a given subject? I often, with my clients, describe it as Pareto's principle, or the 80-20 rule on steroids. For anyone who doesn't know, the 80-20 rule is just another way of talking about this. It's a belief that a gentleman, Pareto, came up with, and perhaps other people in other cultures did too, but, hashtag European and white supremacy or domination. I prefer to say domination because I don't think it's actually supreme, so I don't even like to use words that indicate that it is. But anyway, it's been taught to me as something that this gentleman Pareto came up with when he noticed that often 20% of the effort produced 80% of the results. So if someone was giving 100% effort, that 20% of that disproportionately produced 80% of the outcomes. And 80% of it actually only produced 20% of the outcomes. So this principle inspires us to ask, where in this scenario is a ladder, kind of like in Chutes and Ladders? Where is there a point to skip effectively, to make other steps, not skip steps actually, because in general, I'm not a fan of skipping steps, but just make various steps unnecessary, like in Chutes and Ladders. So it's not that it would make any difference in the game if somebody, for those of us who remember that game, that it would make a difference that they take those 10 steps. It just cut them out and made them unnecessary, right? Where is there a lever we can pull that does something similar, or an intervention point that creates or that like changes or impacts multiple things all at once? So as I started to allude to before, but wanted to explain this idea a little bit more so that you'd understand this principle, the one thing principle, the 80-20 or Pareto's principle on steroids, is applicable in work, in life, in your leadership, in racial justice work, in your marriage, in your relationships with your family members or friends, in virtually every aspect of life. Sometimes one conversation changes everything. At times, one boundary shifts things dramatically. And now there might be many boundaries that you could set, but there's likely one that's key in your personal life and or your leadership, such that by setting it and establishing appropriate consequences or sets of actions, if that boundary is crossed, that by doing that, many other things in your life become easier, and or difficulties or challenges become unnecessary. And there's likely other boundaries that you could set, but almost always there will be ones that are disproportionately more valuable. And if you take a little more time to reflect, you'll notice, and this is very relatively subjective based upon one's set of circumstances, experiences, and needs. And so it takes a little bit of effort and focus for me. Maybe it's just generally not an easy thing, which I think might in part be true. And also maybe it also is impacted by my ADHD. it took me a while to really understand and reflect about this. And with certain things, for me in my experience, now this is just anecdotal. I don't think that this is universally true. There might be people for whom this is quite easy, and that's great for them. And also, if it seems easy, you might want to double check, and you might have self-awareness and have received lots of evaluations, so you know your self-assessment is accurate. And there might be some folks who think this is easy, but they might not be actually experiencing the optimal potential of this principle. So for me, as I think about when I first began thinking about this, it took me a while to notice when I first began applying this for my life and leadership, just for my life overall. And I wanted to, because of my conditioning, say my work priorities were my top one. But at the time, I was experiencing some health challenges in meaningful ways for the first time in my life. And I realized after a while, like that actually was my one thing, that by handling that piece, then the work would become easier, and various extra accommodation measures that I needed to take, I could reduce because I would be well enough that I wouldn't need them anymore. So it can take some, it's not always immediately obvious. And often the thing that feels obvious may not actually be. It might be in that 80%, or it might be in the 20%, but it's not the 20% of the 20%, right? Within the 20% of the 20%. So getting back to my notes of some ideas I wanted to share, at times one boundary can change everything. Others, one insight or intervention can reorganize or relieve years or months or days of struggle frequently. And before I forget, it's worth me naming here, because I wasn't planning on talking about in this episode, is that nearly all of Joyous Justice's offerings account for this principle and concept, especially Grounded and Growing and the forthcoming offerings. They are designed to be leveraged interventions so that when you work on these issues, and often they are deceptively accessible, not always, but often, and you really commit to them and do them, other things in your leadership and life will immediately and increasingly become easier or unnecessary in ways that are desirable and help you regain access to spaciousness and clarity and rootedness in your life, because that one intervention or practice created a cascade of downstream positive and or relieving effects. People consistently underestimate leverage. And when you do, transformation can feel, or the potential for transformation can feel much farther away than it actually is. Not every wall needs extreme force to fall. Some shifts begin when we become more rooted, clear, and more skillful. So I want to take us back to 2011. Back in 2011, when I was in my late 20s, I was deeply wrestling with some personal reflections and considerations as I was deeply inspired and also catalyzed and generatively agitated by the Occupy Wall Street movement. I remember when it first began to really get traction in the media, and I was so inspired. I'm someone who long idolized the civil rights era, and up until about 5 years ago, thought that I was born at the wrong point in time. And then eventually I finally noticed, like, both, yes, that was a magical time. It was also a very painful time. And while our current conditioning and socialization makes it harder for us to engage in movement work, that there is just as much potency and sacred purpose at this time. Whew. Isn't that an understatement? But I finally, about 5 years ago, realized, like, no, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, and even if I'm not, like, I'm going to make the most of this while I'm here. And so during Occupy Wall Street, it was so exciting because it felt like a movement was really getting mobilized, and it was in that moment. People were naming real harms and were organizing and mobilizing and were pushing back against oppressive systems that had and were, and to this day increasingly continue to produce tremendous suffering and harm. And the movement just modeled and exemplified so much courage and passion and commitment. And I also began to notice, as the movement continued on, over those days and weeks, that some of the same themes that I was grappling with, I think Occupy also had to face too, around the finiteness of our physical form and energy. At the time, I was working multiple jobs. I was working full time at a nonprofit while also working full time serving in a volunteer capacity as the president, or essentially the acting executive director of the Jewish Multiracial Network. And I was pushing myself extremely hard, in part because I was in the process of actively testing what are the limits of my physical capacity. And I was finding out I was hitting those limits. And around the same time as Occupy launched, and then was experiencing some movement lessons that we collectively have since learned from and have woven into our strategies going forward. And also we're reaching the limits of people's physical human capacity. And this was a time in my life for the past several years when I've been having an ongoing spiritual awakening in terms of mysticism and spirituality, and getting important precognitive and or psychic messages in my dreams through as my uncle Eddie Two Bears Peart would say, during my night visions, as well as during visions at times that I would occasionally have. Not trying to, would just have them during day, which I learned from my uncle Two Bears, which he refers to as day visions. And so I felt that I was in parallel process with the Occupy movement, and not just because I was visiting the DC-based encampment where I was living at the time, but also because it was clear that people in the movement were getting exhausted and sacrificing a lot. And while I wasn't doing that as closely with Occupy, I was doing that in my own life and activism and leadership. And it was clear that in both contexts, many of us were giving everything we had. And yet the scale of the problems we were facing were still felt and were still so enormous. And it was around that time that I began to notice for myself quietly. I didn't share it with anyone, but I got very, very clear that from my intuition, I don't know, that I wouldn't make the progress, and that we and that other people generally, collectively, wouldn't make the kind of massive progress and achieve the sort of massive impact and success in the service of repairing the world and collective liberation in the ways that we wanted through working alone, that the tasks were just too great, and approaching this in a linear way wouldn't work. And it was clear to me from that place, even as my mysticism and spirituality was just starting to break above ground in the consciousness of my own mind through various experiences and learnings, I began to become more clear that I would need to, for me, and I don't think everyone needs to do this, but that for me and a number of us, we would need to strengthen our capacity to work with energy and through spirit. That it truly wasn't going to be through this physical plane and world alone. That we would need access, that a number of us would need access to precognitive information that wasn't available through any other portal than through spirit, because the oppressive government ain't going to provide it, or actors that we're navigating and encountering weren't going to provide it. That we would need to have different forms of knowing and insight and strength and inspiration and clarity about not just how to move in a linear fashion, but how to intuitively identify these different chutes and ladders and portals and levers that could help us effectively bend the moral arc of justice without without all this endless, infinite incremental work. In short, I started asking different questions. And that's where I landed in terms of what else might be available. What other forms of intelligence have we been taught and or conditioned heavily to ignore? Some natural human capacities that we have that have been dismissed or underdeveloped. And that's when my spirituality, this curiosity, and this profound lifelong commitment to repairing the world and pursuing and advancing collective liberation. At the time, I called it social justice, but I meant collective liberation and positive, profound, loving revolution. The curiosity around how can I do this powerfully and sustainably and help the movements and organizations and communities, et cetera, that I love make phenomenal progress in record time. And for me, I got clear that part of my task from that point on was to not just only continue to curiously and appreciatively notice my spiritual and mystical blooming and evolution, but actually proactively pursue it and cultivate it. And as I did this, I considered that I would be closeted and hidden and underground about it. Like I wanted community at that time, and I created a Facebook group. It may have since been deleted because I didn't do anything with it, but I considered launching a private group that I would run anonymously. And that's where I hit a stumbling block because I was like, how am I going to anonymously run a group? That doesn't make sense. Called the Spiritual Underground for other folks who want to get more rigorous in their spiritual and mystical capacities and also navigate daily circumstances, cultures, communities where potentially doing so could endanger their belonging, which is very much how I felt at that point in my career. I felt at the time like I was already really pushing the Jewish community on a number of fronts and sharing my evolving spirituality and mysticism and the interspirituality and intercultural nature of it would be too agitational in mainstream Jewish spaces, especially since the majority of our community and or a large percentage of our community, like 60 to 70%, are white Ashkenazi Jews. And certainly people in this country who have been conditioned within whiteness have been even more heavily conditioned to distance themselves from the realms of energy and spirit and mysticism. And it felt dangerous and unsafe at the time for me to mention or be open about that. And yet it was clear to me, because of my Afro-indigeneity and also my inherent humanity now, I would say, that I got to continue to pursue that intensely, but in a more private and underground manner. And just to clarify, I wasn't doing this as an escape from action nor a replacement for strategy, but as an exploration of what might become possible when force and effort and willpower was or is no longer the only tool that I was using. I started out with it as a personal experiment. And over time, what I learned in the 10 plus years since I made that personal commitment and vow to myself that there are lots of tools and insights that are readily available to lots of people if they're taught about them and how to use them, that can be incredibly positively consequential and impactful, and have been throughout my career. It's led to actions and initiatives that I've intuitively launched that have led to award-winning results for me and for my clients and mentees. So all of this to say, effort And work is absolutely an element of transformation, and also force and effort alone is and was never going to get us there. It's just not. There's a few more segments that I wanted to do in this episode. So I think I'm going to split this into 2 parts, and we'll publish this part 1 and pick it up with the second half for part 2 in the following episode. So please stay tuned for more.
Thanks for tuning in. To learn more about Joyous Justice LLC and how you can work with April, check out the info in the show notes or visit joyousjustice.com. If you enjoyed this episode, show some love. Subscribe or leave a comment wherever you're listening. Tell your people, share what you're learning, stay humble but not too humble, and keep going, because the future is ours to co-create.